Dr. Alessandra Comini is a prolific author, a world-known lecturer, an art historian, and the author of The Changing Image of Beethoven, a study in myth-making. And this is the book that prompted me to call you, because it's a thickly woven delight, and it really follows the myth of Beethoven from his lifetime up to today. In fact, the myth of Beethoven actually began in his lifetime, didn't it?
Yes, it did. People found him a genius. People complimented him. He was able to play almost anything so early. He memorized all of the Bach literature for the piano. I guess literature isn't quite the right word, but yes, he memorized all 32, what are they? Preludes and fugues. Oh, right. Well, anyway, yes, the myth started when he was still alive. And by the time he got to Vienna, they already knew about him. And it's funny, there are two pronunciations of his name. In his Rhinish homeland in Bonn, they knew that it meant that Beethoven meant beet garden or beet field. So they called him Beethoven. But when he got to Vienna, because of a Viennese rule for compound words, they called him Beethoven. So that's already a myth. Was he called Beethoven or Beethoven? So from there on, the myth began to grow. Probably more about his music than his personality, although later literature seems to focus so much on his oftentimes sullen personalities. But of course, you and I and all the world finally, after the Heiligenstadt Testament of 1802, we know why he was sullen, why he was despondent, his loss of hearing. And
that made him a hero even in his day. The fact that he overcame that loss of hearing.
Yes, yes. And the conversation booklets that he was forced to carry with him, they have become a myth in their own right. People would give anything to find just one more conversation book. And people look, too.
Didn't Schindler have something to do with that?
Oh, yes, Schindler, goodness. And he's the one who found the Heiligenstadt Testament among Beethoven's letters after Beethoven died, because Schindler was his off and on again amanuensis. So, yeah, leave it to Schindler to find something like that.
And he also found another thing that became part of the Beethoven myth, the letter to the immortal beloved.
You are so right. And scholars have fought battles ever since in trying to identify who she was. What do you think about it?
I like a mystery, actually. I don't really want to know. Do you have an idea? Do you have a theory about who it might be?
Oh, I believe what William Meredith, the founding director of the Beethoven Institute in San Jose, California, what he now believes, and that is that Bettina Brentano actually was the real beloved, immortal beloved. And she was one of the few people, especially women, whom he addressed in the intimate form, du, in that final letter to the immortal beloved. So we have that evidence too.
The image that you speak about in your book, The Changing Image of Beethoven, began with a series of portraits that were painted of him during his lifetime, as well as posthumous portraits. There are a couple here. I'd like to point them out to you, and I'll also put better copies down below. But there are two here, the Shimon portrait on the top.
Yes.
Steeler portrait on the bottom.
Yes. Well, the one I like is the bottom, because it shows Beethoven holding the Missa Solemnis in D sharp. And of course, as you know, that was common in the 19th century. In order to be sure, people played the piece in D. So the custom in Germany, at least, was to put the sharp on it. Yes, that's a very fine portrait. My favorite one, though, is actually much later, well, not so much later, but closer to his death. And that was done by the Austrian artist Waldmüller. And I think that's also in the book. And it shows him very severe and not from once leonine and glaring out, but thoughtful, reflective man with thin eyebrows. Usually we see him with big bushy eyebrows and hair that's beginning to go white. So I very much like that portrait by Waldmüller because I think it draws out the inner Beethoven. And Wagner had a reproduction of that particular portrait on his wall. And the images on Wagner's wall are fodder for another book, really. But, well, I'm jumping ahead of the people who helped make Beethoven a legend.
Well, one of the things that I like to point out is that the scowl that Beethoven is always portrayed with, like the ones behind me,
yes,
is the face of a man with 2 pounds of wet plaster.
2 pounds of wet gypsum, yes, on his face, plus 2 straws up his nose so that he could breathe while that wet plaster was getting solid. And the first time round, he couldn't take it. He ripped the half-baked gypsum off his face. And poor Franz Klein had to start all over again. He was an anatomical sculptor. And so they put it on again, and Beethoven waited and waited. It just took too long, and so he ripped it off, threw it on the ground. It broke into 7 major pieces, and Beethoven said, "Nie wieder," never again, and just ran out of the room. But Franz Klein was able to put those pieces back. And that's why Beethoven is scowling. He was so terribly uncomfortable and getting claustrophobic by the second, as you and I would. Let's see if you can look like Beethoven for a second with the plaster. Exactly. Now you look just like him, and me too, maybe. Let's see.
Oh my goodness. Now the image of Beethoven among his contemporaries was different from what we view today. In other words, his contemporaries spoke about him as a person. Some of them even said that he didn't look like his paintings or his sculptures. He was a very, he didn't have that, fierce look to him all the time.
Right.
And you point out in the book too about his sort of humorous, the humorous part of his personality. Like he would look at women through a lorgnette to make sure. And he was very vain because he didn't want to be shown with his glasses. I remember reading that in your book.
Didn't he read? He composed something for himself and a violinist, I think, called For Two People Who Have to Wear Glasses. I forget how it goes in German, but it's really cute the way he inscribed that. Yeah. Well, like some of our presidents, they don't like to be seen wearing glasses and in public, and we know they have to use glasses. And you.
Now, going forward from the 18th to the 19th century to the 20th century, Beethoven shows up in so many places. For example, during World War II, his Fifth Symphony became a symbol for America.
That's right. Which, of course, is the Morse code for the letter V, 3 dots, 1 dash. So I love the irony of the British radioing that over to the Germans with knowing that the Germans said V, and then it comes back to Britain. A wonderful juxtaposition there. Yeah, that was perfect, to use Beethoven to conquer the Germans.
And in Berlin, during the fall of the wall, his music was played.
Isn't that wonderful? We have those photographs of young kids just hitting the wall, coming down. What I really also remember, well, I don't remember, I wasn't in Vienna at the time, but I was alive, is when the Vienna Opera, which was so badly destroyed during World War II, 10 years later, 1955, they were ready for their first performance, and they had loudspeakers outside because so many people were gathered around the Ringstrasse. And of course, the opera they chose was Fidelio. So I love that too. So you've got the triumph of Fidelio, and then you have it again when Bernstein conducted it. Yeah, at the demolition of that wall. So Beethoven involved with that, of the things that he's been involved with. And you have asked me in the past, why do we need Beethoven? Why is there a myth? And I think your question is pungent and very, very good. And in the light of things that are happening recently, I think that each generation needs a hero, not necessarily a politician, not necessarily a military person. And we've seen statues pulled down now of former military people and former politicians. So it's rather fascinating to see that who comes up? Beethoven comes up. His music comes up. So we do need heroes, all of us. And he keeps recurring as the hero whose music we can sink ourselves into and have it as our inspiration.
Now, speaking of statues, there are statues all over the world of Beethoven.
Over 100.
One statue in particular, and this is what I wanted to ask you, was the genesis for your book.
Oh, at Max Klinger's statue of Beethoven, finished in 1902 and exhibited in Vienna at the Secession, the group of modern artists headed by Klimt. Yes, what a spectacle that must have been. And Gustav Mahler went there, you know. In fact, he orchestrated the music of Beethoven's, I think it was the eighth he played. It doesn't matter which one, but he orchestrated it for just a few instruments, but it sounded so vast in the halls of his Secession, which still exists. It's a great tourist spot if one goes to Vienna. But that was a cultural event that just had ripples and ripples. And the sculpture was just one part of it, this life-size polychromatic image of Beethoven sitting on a small throne with little putti around him, 9 of them for the 9 symphonies. And he was in sort of thought like this. And it was spectacular, but accompanying it in a side room was Gustav Klimt's Beethoven Freeze. And the reaction to it was, is this philosophy or pornography? Because some of Klimt's naked women were in the frieze, of course. But the focus was on Beethoven. Also, by the way, his position like this, you may want to cut this, engendered cartoons that showed Beethoven sitting on his throne. And there's a little character who holds up a bottle and says, "This man can be helped." So they like the innuendo of the toilet motif.
So he's not that big.
Cut that, aren't you? I'm sorry. Okay, let me calm down again.
Now, we spoke about your book and the fact that it was written in the 80s, but there's a new edition coming out. And you've written a new epilogue about the global influence of Beethoven.
Yes, it certainly has gone around the world, all the continents, all the major continental islands, and even Antarctica. For instance, in the 1950s already, some British researchers named a small peninsula the Beethoven Peninsula. Well, there you are in Antarctica. Could he ever have thought of such a thing himself? Did we even know there was an Antarctica in the early 19th century?
Well, and you also mentioned China.
Oh, yes. In fact, I went there last October before the COVID-19, just in order to photograph the remarkable image head of Beethoven set in the music part of Qingdao. And it is remarkable because it's the typical Beethoven whom we know from the frown and all that and the curly locks, but it is in front of downtown Qingdao. So you have at a remove of a park, you have these incredible Chinese skyscrapers. You know, they're all different sizes and even shapes, but they dominate, except that Beethoven's head is in front of him, so he dominates them. And on the label, of course, is his name in both Roman letters and Chinese characters. But the best thing about it is that they have sculpted, let's see how many. Freude, schöner Gotter, Funken, Tochter aus Elysium. So 15 notes from the beginning of the fourth movement. So that is so great because people from all over the world can come there, and those who can read music are standing there singing it. So a wonderful global Beethoven right there.
And what about Li Shutong? You mentioned him in the epilogue, too.
Yes. So thank you, Li Shutong. He brought Beethoven to China as early as 1906, just 4 years after the Secession Max Klinger Beethoven. And he discovered Beethoven not in China, but in Japan, where apparently they set nursery rhymes to his music. So he was impressed by Beethoven's biography, and that's what he did when he came back to China. He began a little music newspaper, and he wrote the first article called The Sage, Beethoven the Sage. And he interpreted him not from his music, which he did not know and had never heard, but from his life. And of course, this has continued till now. But the fact that Beethoven overcame such an obstacle as deafness really spoke to him and to the Chinese, who at that time were fighting the Kong dynasty and trying to get on with modernizing China. So yes, Li Shutong, who lived until, I think, 1943, he became a monk at the end of his life. But Li Shutong was single-handedly responsible for bringing Beethoven to China. And Japan, of course, followed suit. And in the 1914, I think it was, a tremendous Beethoven scandal took place in Japan when the conductor, whom everyone called the Japanese Beethoven, turned out to be a hoax. He had pretended all along that he was deaf, and he had a teacher at the conservatory compose in secret for him his first symphony, which was called the Hiroshima Symphony. And it turned out that he had not written the symphony and that he was not, as he pretended to be, deaf. So Beethoven in many guises.
Well, that's so interesting that he's in Asia becomes such a figure. But I'm interested because that Li Shutong had never heard his music. That's so rare to grab a hold of a character just because of his personality.
Yes, that's right. His life history. It's just alien to us, isn't it? But right. The idea, the Chinese always thought of music as the height of morality, but not the musicians. They didn't get paid much. And so I think that the Chinese were ready for a hero of moral sincerity and someone who had conquered such a handicap.
Let me talk about some of the other writing you do.
All right.
A historian or an art historian or a music historian. You also like to solve crimes.
As long as they're fictional, yes.
Tell us about your series of crime novels. And in fact, Beethoven figures in the latest one.
Yes, and it just arrived from Amazon. I just happened to have it here. But first I will show you this business card, because this is the heroine of all the novels, and there are 8 of them now. And she is Megan Crespi. She is 85, like her author, and she travels around the world solving art and music crimes. And on the back of her card are the first 7 of her books. So, yes, this is the Beethoven book. It's finally arrived, and it's called the Beethoven Boomerang. And it's the thickest novel that I've ever written. It's 388 pages, imagine. And I just happened to have one on Mahler. This was the previous one. And guess what? I just happened to have the one before that, the Kandinsky Conundrum. Oh, and I happen to have the Coleridge here, Kitty Coleridge. I had to write about a woman, and I know we're getting off musicians, but who would not want to read about Edvard Munch, the man who painted the Scream? So the Munch murders, and here is the Scream. And oh dear, I have a trio of books on Viennese artists, Kokoschka, Egon Schiele, and maybe you see my big book on him over there. Can you see that? Yeah. That was nominated for the National Book Award, by the way. And that was the reason that I began studying Beethoven and the Great Exhibition of 1902, because Schiele adored Gustav Klimt, this one. And that brought me to the 1902 exposition. And I became enamored of that statue, that magnificent statue with the Empyrean eagle at its base staring up to Beethoven. So that made me wonder, what is it about Beethoven that everybody thought he was so marvelous? Why is he a hero? And that just sent me to what I thought were going to be just lots of illustrations of Beethoven statues and portraits. But instead, it turned into a cultural study of the times, why he meant so much to each period, and especially in the Romantic age, and Berlioz and Wagner. So that set me on my career. I'd never intended to write on a musician, on a composer, but that's got me set for life.
Where do you see it going? I think the myth will continue. What do you think?
I do. I think we all need a Beethoven, and for the Western world, but now also for the Orient, if I can still use that term, he has become such an inspiration, a man who overcame horrible handicaps. I think we will always have a Beethoven.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end our discussion. Thank you, Dr. Alessandra Comini.
Thank you. My favorite classical music radio announcer and host.
Well, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.